It's only a matter of time before all of these turn violent, unfortunately. But blood is cheaper than water in today's day and age. I don't think people still fully understand just how little water we have, right? We will certainly see genocides and wars break out over water. I think that's inevitable. Weaponizing water is even more devastating on an opponent than the use of nuclear weapons.
You're watching the Gist on Strat News Global. I'm Nilanthan Niruthan. Our regular viewers will surely remember our guest for today. We have Mr. Nilanthan Niruthan, the director of the Center for Law and Security Studies in Colombo, but more importantly, one of the brightest young strategic minds in this part of the country, part of the world, to be honest. So very glad to have you with us. It's a delight, as always, Toots.
I'm the one who's delighted to be back. Thank you so much.
So, I was just thinking of one small thing to begin with. You know that there's been this crisis happening in India. I want to check with you on what the Sri Lankans think about that, number one. And then we'll move on to water wars, not necessarily in the subcontinent. So, maybe you'd like to just tell me what is the mood in Sri Lanka? Is it in the news? Is it being discussed, or is it just another warm terrorist attack?
No, it's certainly in the news. There's certainly a lot of fear and anxiety over it, particularly because of our own precarious position as well. So we cannot afford this region to destabilize any further because we ourselves are in the economic doldrums, so to speak. Even though we are hopefully on the road to recovery, there's a lot of work yet to be done, and instability is not a burden that we can afford to bear at the moment. So if times were better, we might have afforded to take up some kind of ideological position on it. But because this is such an economically existential problem for us at the moment, South Asian stability, the reaction
Hmm.
here is almost universally just fear and worry and anxiety, rather than actually picking a side on ideological lines.
It's not a question of picking a sides, but do people actually say that, look, there's war happening, it's likely to go further? Or
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just think of the optics of an IPL match just being stopped in order for the stadium to be evacuated and all that. Now, many people here watch the IPL as well. And in terms of the news coverage, particularly because of how intense the news coverage has been in both sides, yes, there's a tremendous
Mhm.
amount of interest in it here, and everybody is talking about it.
That's interesting because, one of the things that India did from within days of this attack was that, they stopped, they put what the technical term is, they put the Indus Waters Treaty in abeyance, which essentially means that, you are using water as a weapon of war in many ways. I mean, there's no other way to put it. Now, we can do it. I suppose the Chinese who are upstream from us can do it. It can go on. I mean, it's a vicious cycle. But I remember talking to you once long ago, and you mentioning that there are lots of places around the world where they have similar problems. Would you like to start, talking about some of the other ones that are there, particularly in Africa? I'm told there's a lot of issues.
Oh, yes. So the entire Sahel region in Africa, which is that small strip that separates the north of Africa with sub-Saharan Africa, there have been numerous water-related conflicts. In fact, if you look at most of the pastoral tribal communities in these countries, it's almost become a day-to-day thing for them to war with other tribes for just controls of small water bodies and stuff like that. It's by no means restricted just to Africa. So if you remember in 2021, there were clashes between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan over irrigation water agreements, and I think something like 40 or 50 people died in that clash in 1995, if I remember right. Peru and Ecuador briefly went to war over control of a certain river there. So water is unfortunately one of those things where any weaponization of it or any scarcity even of it presents an existential threat to that particular community. And therefore, they are forced to fight until the end, because if you don't have water, it is the end anyway. So you're forced to fight until the end. In Africa, the most primary example is what's happening in the Nile basin right now. So most of our viewers would know that the River Nile, which conjures up images for us of ancient Egypt and all that, is so closely associated to the Egyptian civilization and all that. But Egypt is actually the last place the Nile actually gets to. It originates in Ethiopia, it goes through Sudan, and it then gets into Egypt. And right now, Ethiopia is building a giant dam. I think it's called the Ethiopia Renaissance Dam or something like that, which is almost on the border between Ethiopia and Sudan, which
Mm.
Egypt sees as a huge violation of its water rights. So there's a 1959 treaty between these countries, particularly Egypt and Sudan, that agrees on how much water they should get. But Ethiopia's like, hey guys, that was in 1959. That was a completely different world back then. We have our own needs now. We have our own requirements now. Kind of like India's argument with the Indus Water Treaty as well, which is that
Right.
something made 70 years ago does not reflect the needs and realities of today's world. So Egypt has said that it will not rule out any military options if it does start facing water shortages because of the Great Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia. So, right in front of our eyes in Africa, in the cradle of civilization, so to speak, there is a huge water based conflict brewing. Even if we were to go slightly more towards Asia, towards the West Asian, Middle Eastern region, there's the
Mm-hmm.
Euphrates Tigris base, which involves Syria, Turkey, and Iraq. And some of our viewers might remember that in 1975, Syria and Turkey almost went to war with each other over this, and the Saudis had to step in and mediate a peace. So the Euphrates and the Tigris, most of it originates from Turkey, and now Turkey has built many, many dams, and Syria and Iraq complain that there's not enough water coming down to them. And in today's world, with climate change and industrial agriculture and all that exacerbating water crises around the world, it's only a matter of time before all of these turn violent, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Now, I don't know about the common person, but we as journalists have been hearing about, water being the next cause for war for the last, 2 decades now. That water is going to be the big problem. Water is going to be the big problem. Do you think it's already upon us?
I think it already is. The prediction first came in I believe it was 95 or 96 by the former vice chairman of the World Bank, whose quote, if
Mm-hmm.
I remember right, was he said, just as how wars were fought over oil in the 20th century, they would be fought over water in the 21st century. If I remember the quote right. And to a certain extent, I think we're already seeing that come true. There are numerous hotspots all over the world where this is essentially brewing. Even the industrial world is not immune from this. I mean, there's the Colorado River in the United States, which is drying up, which has already created a number of very mean-spirited legal battles between between the American states themselves, all of whom want to
Mm-hmm.
make sure that they are not deprived of the Colorado River as the water levels keep going down. So yes, the point is, and this might not sound very benevolent, unfortunately, but blood is cheaper than water in today's day and age. And what I mean by that is we are increasingly looking at countries more than willing to resort to violence in order to protect access to water, because it's such an essential, it's kind of like oxygen, right? It's weaponizing
Absolutely.
water, it's like weaponizing oxygen. So we are just seeing a very steep increase in the number of countries who are willing to go to war over this one particular resource.
Among all this, the Indus Water Treaty was seen as a shining example of a treaty that didn't go, didn't get defunct despite so many wars. But now that seems to have been sort of, well, they're saying held in abeyance. I'm not quite sure what that exactly means. Um, are there any other similar treaties around the world which sort of help sort of mitigate some of these concerns,
So
which one can look at?
The United States and Canada, if I'm not mistaken, have a few agreements. But then a few weeks ago, the United States said that it was pausing negotiations on some of those agreements. The problem with water is that it's so important that the passage of time will always change the equation. You might think that you have some kind of equitable, fair water sharing arrangement, and it might very well be a fair water sharing arrangement for that time being. But as industrialization happens, as populations increase, as food demands rise, because I think 70% of the world's usable water goes towards agriculture. It's only 10% that's used in households and about 20% that's used in industries. But 70% of the world's usable water goes into agriculture. So, for instance, 1 kilo of beef on average takes about 15,000 liters of water
Good Lord.
to produce. So
Good
it's
Lord.
a massively disproportionate process that we see. So as your industrialization and your population goes up, all of these water treaties will inevitably become outdated.
So where is the solution? Because water itself is also slowly becoming slightly scarce with, the sort of water flows have become thinner because the glaciers have started melting. So at the end of the day, we're looking like, sort of a very um, catastrophic kind of a situation already.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is why the argument that water will be the biggest cause of war in the 21st century is a very, very valid argument. When we look at the emerging conflicts in the global south today,
Hmm.
civilization and water seem to be the two key drivers of most conflicts in the global south, particularly in arid regions like sub-Saharan Africa and Central Asia, and all that. So ultimately, industrial farming is something that many countries in the global south have started seeing as a source of revenue. So, for example, Egypt is one of the world's biggest exporters of potatoes, right? And it's a big revenue generator for the Egyptian economy. But potatoes are very water intensive crops. And now that Ethiopia is damming the Nile, then happens to the Egyptian potato industry, which now exports these potatoes all over the world, or even European nations, which export a lot of meat. We've already started seeing France demolish many of their dams because they've realized that this has become a problem and that the over proliferation of dams has now reduced their water levels and created water scarcity because it damages the ecosystem and things like that. And it's the economic imperative which leads to all these water shortages. So the solution here is to fix the economic imperative rather than to simply tell people to be more responsible with water, if that makes sense.
I mean, as long as it's flowing freely, people won't look at it very responsibly. That's the problem. But you mentioned Europe. In Europe, do they have any sort of conflict kind of a situation vis-a-vis the waters there? Because I haven't heard of any, but barring Ukraine and Russia, of course. But beyond that, have you heard of anybody else fighting over water? Because they too would need water in every way like others do.
Yeah, not particularly. Well, it's also because of the interconnectivity there. It's just that water management itself is far more efficiently done there than it typically is in, once again, using the term global south, than it would be in the global south. They have individual problems. So France, Spain, many of these countries have started dealing with individual water scarcity problems, but it's not really gotten into a geopolitical tussle per se.
So apart from Africa, you mentioned, I mean, Egypt and Egypt being downstream. Where else do you see conflicts sort
Oh,
of bubbling under the surface?
I mean, just look at East Asia, the Mekong Basin, the Mekong River, which
Hmm.
flows from China into countries like Laos and Vietnam and Cambodia and all that. Vietnam has already publicly complained that China's building of dams is creating floods in Vietnam. Thailand has lodged similar complaints. Cambodia is now on the verge of building a super dam on their own side, and we have no idea what the ecological impact of this will be. So even in Southeast Asia, we clearly see this problem coming up again, where water and geopolitics become intertwined, right? So the questions geopolitically, the questions now become, so at what point does the weaponization of water become a regular tool in the warfare toolkit of a nation, right? If we normalize it, at what point of time does everybody simply start using this as an excuse? The second is, how does this impact global geopolitics? So, for instance, we know what the relationship between the colonial powers and spices were, where they wanted to invade countries with spices. There's been so much controversy about, let's say, Washington foreign policy and its links to oil over the 70s and 80s and 90s and 2000s and all that. So, when water becomes a valuable resource, when water becomes a monetizable resource, are we looking at the world powers of that day now conquering other countries that do have fresh water? Because I don't think people still fully understand just how little water we have, right? Because we're supposed to be a blue planet, and instinctively we all assume that there must be enough water to go around for everybody. But the truth is that 97% of the world's water is salt water. Only about 3% is actual fresh water, and most of that are up in the glaciers. According to a recent report, it's just 0.003% of the world's water reserves that we actually use, that we can actually use. So imagine that, right? It's just
That's less than
0.003,
1%. Okay.
less, far a hundredth of a percent. So if we think of
Hmm.
a large barrel of water, and this is just a teaspoon of water in that barrel, which is actually accessible for us. So we can solve the equation by going into desalination and all that, but ultimately it's a very, very tiny, tiny chunk of the world's water reserves that every country, that all of humanity has to share with each other. And this is where the problems pop up.
Hmm. So desalination is one option. What are the other sort of radical options that you can think of?
So the other thing would be just awareness about water management and not wasting water and all that. We could look at two examples. So Singapore has a huge water crisis, but because
Hmm.
Singapore has a lot of industrial and political power in terms of exercising jurisdiction in its own territory and all that, they've invested very heavily in desalination. They've invested very heavily in catchment areas where you trap the rainwater and you make sure that it's diverted to areas where people can put it to good use and all that. So that is a rich country's solution. We also have Cape Town. I mean, South Africa technically is a rich nation or whatever, but Cape Town a few years ago had a major water crisis, and they battled it almost purely through public awareness. So they had this thing called Day Zero. Day Zero was the day that that Cape Town would run out of water. So they started a public countdown, and every single day people would go through that countdown, which created awareness that you needed to save water. It created awareness that waste management and things like that had to be done more effectively, that citizens needed to have some kind of civic responsibility in terms of using water. And through that public awareness campaign, they were able to push day zero further and further away, to the point where then they just forgot about the day zero thing because they had stabilized the situation by then. So there are technological solutions for it, and there are just old-fashioned public awareness solutions as well.
So ideally, it would need both because I remember Saudi Arabia used to tow icebergs from somewhere to get its water supply. If you remember,
Yeah,
that can't
exactly.
be a scalable proposition.
No,
I mean,
as in they thought that it would be a scalable proposition because they thought that the technology to do it would get cheaper. So, because ultimately, let's face it, countries determine whether something is sustainable or not based on the economic cost and not particularly based on what might happen to the planet 100 years from now if we do this. So it was the cost thing that turned that into an unsustainable plan rather than concerns for the environment and all that. But you're absolutely right. That was tried.
but does that mean water has become a what we call a limited supply thing in terms of will it eventually will we run out of water? Is that what we're looking at?
I mean, by the time we run out of water, my guess would be that desalination and all that would be a much more efficient technology, and we would be able to get things under control. So it's not like the world is going to run out of usable water because, as I said, the geopolitical stage itself involves a tiny fraction of the world's actual water reservoir.
Hmm.
So the idea that we would run out of it without being able to manipulate the existing water into more usable thing, I think that's far-fetched. I think we will find some solution, but we will certainly see genocides and wars break out over water. I think that's inevitable. We will see at least a half dozen genocides over water. We will see at least 2 to 3 dozen wars over water as well over the next 50 or 60 years. It just seems inevitable at this point.
I mean, we mentioned Africa, we mentioned perhaps Southeast Asia. Anywhere else that comes to mind?
Uh, I mean, there are just water-related disputes. Like I said, the Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan tensions, Ecuador and Peru, the United States and Canada. So these are all things that might flare into a violent conflict in the future. But I would say the Nile Basin, which we discussed, Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan, the Tigris Euphrates Basin, Syria, Iraq, and Turkey, the Indus Basin, India and Pakistan, the Brahmaputra Basin, India and China, the Mekong Basin, China and the Southeast Asian nations, and finally the
Hmm.
Colorado River, which we discussed as well, infighting legal battles between all the different American states. Those, I would say, are the key flashpoints for an actual conflict to potentially break out.
And do you see some kind of a solution coming through? Let's talk about the Nile. Come back to the Nile. I mean, is it a sort of a standoff situation where both sides are talking at each other, or are there actual ways and means being done to renegotiate something or do something to satisfy
There have
both
been
sides?
there have been numerous discussions over the years, and none of these discussions have actually led to any resolution that all three countries have been willing to agree upon. Because once again, when it comes to water and oxygen,
Hmm.
regardless of what our morals and ethics might be, we covet it like nothing else because it's just a basic survival thing. So
Oh,
Ethiopia
absolutely.
Ethiopia wants to keep as much of the water as possible. Ethiopia's argument is that it's their land and they can do whatever they want. And Egypt's argument is that there's some responsibility for what happens to a river and you can't just dam it up as well. Kind of like the arguments that, let's say, India and China are likely to make
Right.
in the future when that actually
Hmm.
comes up. So the other major problem is that there is no mediating body. It's not like the International Court of Justice has credibility on the world stage in order for it to be able to broker deals between major nations. It's not like the International Criminal Court has any credibility in terms of prosecuting people who weaponize water. Let's face it, when we look at the history of the International Criminal Court, is just a bunch of countries that most people couldn't even point to on the map that the International
True.
Criminal Court takes action against. So it's not like there's a unipolar world with a global policeman like the United States in the 90s. There are now many different power centers around the world. So exacerbating all the water issues is the lack of any central system or mediating authority or a singular force that can bring about some kind of solution. The world is essentially fragmented at this point.
Mhm. And we have melting glaciers. We have both the north and south poles are also melting, which is going to cause global warming, as they keep saying. It's already started. Now that becomes a sort of a double whammy. If you don't have water and at the same time you have global heating, which means you need more water. Um, you think that's going to get worse?
That's definitely going to get much worse, particularly because of such bad policy. Now, for instance, let's just take both our countries or just the South Asian just for a second. Look at how
Hmm.
many of our governments subsidize things like rice and sugarcane and all that in order to encourage these industries. Now, these are extremely water intensive crops.
Right.
Many of our nations in the global south currently depend on growing crops that are extremely water intensive. And unfortunately, we've almost abandoned many of the older staple diets like millets and all that, which were not really that water intensive. So it's also exacerbated by the fact that we're all growing crops that guzzle water, just guzzle it. Strawberries, you need to spend more than something like 100 liters of water or something like that for a kilo of strawberries. Not as much as potatoes and things like that, but we're still talking about a large footprint. Industrial farming and things like beef and meat and all that just have a huge water footprint. But in the global south, because many of us are agricultural societies and many of our political parties often want to position themselves as the saviors of the farmers and all that, we encourage our farming community to grow crops which are destroying the long term future of our water ecosystem.
I mean, all this sounds quite grim. Are you hopeful that something will be worked out soon?
I mean, I'm unfortunately never hopeful about the future of humanity, but I think technology will circumvent a lot of this. If we were to, for instance, study desalination technology and how it's progressed, and when we look at, let's say, a case study like Singapore, I think it is quite possible for us to solve these problems. It's the geopolitics of it that is much more unsolvable. Because, as I said, it doesn't just turn into a water problem, it becomes a civilizational problem. Now, for instance, if there's a
And
tensions between, go on, go on.
no, no, it's civilizational problems you're already having. So on top of that, you're going to add to that.
Yeah, and it also becomes a question of, but this is our civilizations. Egypt says we are entitled to the Nile because Egyptian civilization itself was built on the Nile. Ethiopia says, sorry, we were the original cradle of humanity that thrived off the Nile. We are the ones who are entitled to it. If something happens between India and Pakistan tomorrow, or between China and Cambodia tomorrow, China would say, we are the civilizational, historical custodians of this basin, and it's our land. So it just becomes this never ending struggle over territory, livestock, food, because water is the lifeline of all of it. We can't really separate food security from water security because all our food requires water to grow. So this
Absolutely.
is this is just food and water security coming together. And technologically, there are many ways out of it, but geopolitically, I the picture, as you said, is very grim.
Well, I was hoping you'd come back with a slightly more cheerful kind of a response, but as you said earlier, there are some things which you really can't. I mean, you'd be stupid to be positive about unless you saw some sort of light at the end of the tunnel, which, as you said, is not quite seen right now. And for all you know,
Yeah.
that could be a good strain heading towards you when you see the light. But
Because if you think about it, water is the ultimate weapon of war. I mean, not even nuclear weapons can devastate your enemy the way that weaponizing water can, both in terms of the immediate death toll and in terms of the long term effects and all that. You could make a
of
very
course.
solid argument that weaponizing water is even more devastating on an opponent than the use of nuclear weapons. But most people don't really see it that way because, unfortunately, water is a day to day item that most of us waste unintentionally as well. And therefore, the idea of looking at it as something that's inherently tied to our future, instinct on a surface level, we can. But on a policy level, it's much harder for us to get into that mindset.
I sure hope, I mean, the thinkers and doers of the world are thinking about some ways to do this. I'm sure there's some, as you said, technological advancement that comes suddenly as and when we need it. On that note, I'm sorry we'll have to end this rather interesting conversation. I had some other questions, but I don't think we have the time. Thank you so very much, as always, for making a complicated thing so simple. I mean, the way you explained it, I knew that there were issues, but I wouldn't have been able to explain it the way you did. So thank you for that. And
Always a pleasure.
once again, next time let's come back with something a bit more sort of off the thing which people don't really know about, because that's what I enjoy when I'm talking to you. I get insights into subjects which which are interesting, but which I hadn't thought about in the way you look at it. So thank you very much, and I look forward to having you again.
Thank you.
That was Nilanthan Niruthan, one of the brightest strategic thinkers of the region, talking to us about water as a weapon and what that means for the world. I do hope you enjoyed this particular edition of The Gist, and I look forward to seeing you again. Till then, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This is Ramananda Sengupta.